you guys mistreated her.
Oh, mistreated.
Well, that you called her names and you threatened to throw her out and make her homeless.
I try to help you guys because you need all the help, but every time that I want to save, it's not even enough for me to get the visa. I cannot save enough years. It's so hard for me.
She said, you threatened to throw her out, to make her homeless, to cut her off if she didn't keep handing over her paycheck. And they just stared back, silent, confused, stunned, because they didn't even know such an accusation had ever been made against them, let alone broadcast across countries on. Camera. That was the moment everything shifted. Not gradually, not gently, but in one hard, breathless snap, where everyone at that dinner table suddenly realized they weren't all sharing the same version of reality. For years, Sheena had spun a narrative that painted her parents as cruel and controlling, the kind of family who would exploit their daughter emotionally and financially, and for years, Forrest and his mother Molly had believed her. No hesitation, no questions, just full empathy and instant allegiance. But now, sitting across from two soft-spoken people offering nothing but food, warmth, and quiet welcome, the story started cracking. And the cracks weren't small. They were fractures loud enough to embarrass everyone still pretending they hadn't been manipulated. Molly's instincts didn't shift because of something said, but something unsaid, the disconnect between Sheena's claims and the dignity of the family now sitting silently before her, stunned by the weight of what they were being accused of. This wasn't just awkward, it was reputational destruction disguised as concern, and Molly, for all her intensity and edge, was not the kind of woman to be played for a fool. Not by anyone, not even her future daughter-in-law. You could see it in her face, the exact second she went from visiting guest to uninvited prosecutor, not with rage, but with cold clarity. The kind that comes when a protective mother realizes she's been handed a half-truth, dressed up like a crisis. The tension wasn't just in the room, it was in the air, thick, sharp, waiting. And while Sheena sat quietly, the weight of her own words boomeranging back at her, Forrest kept scanning both sides, like he wanted someone else to step in and fix it. But no one could. Because this wasn't going away. Not now. Not with Molly sitting straight, leaning forward, calculating how to. Expose the lie without even raising her voice. And if you thought that was the worst moment of the night, you're not even close to ready for what she does next. She didn't start with a lie. Not exactly. She started with a struggle. A feeling. The kind that creeps in late at night when you're unsure if the person you love will still want you if they see the full picture. She told Forrest she was barely surviving, that her parents kept her trapped, controlled her income, and treated her more like a bank account than a daughter, and maybe at first it came from a place of exhaustion, or from trying to explain why her savings were always wiped out before she could even think about a visa. But soon the details hardened into a narrative, and the narrative began to carry its own weight, because once you've painted yourself as the person in need of rescuing, the story can't afford to get complicated. Forrest didn't push back. He wanted to believe he was the hero in her story, not just the boyfriend waiting in another country. So when she said her family mistreated her, he listened. When she said they'd threatened to throw her out if she stopped sending money, he sympathized. And when she said she had no one else, he didn't ask for proof, he asked how fast he could help. And Molly, sharp-eyed, territorial, always half suspicious of Sheena anyway, latched onto the claim not because she believed Sheena, but because she believed Forrest needed protecting. And if Sheena came attached with a controlling family and a sob story designed to manipulate him, Molly wanted the full picture, the ugly truth, all of it. What Sheena didn't seem to anticipate was how quickly sympathy can turn to suspicion once people start looking at details, especially when the numbers don't match the story. Visa processes aren't cheap, and long-distance relationships come with pressure most people never admit to. When you're emotionally stretched, physically apart, and financially uneven, control starts to look like care, and need starts to look like manipulation. But instead of breaking under that pressure, Sheena chose to manage perception. Was she shielding her family from judgment, or was she crafting a version of herself that made Forrest hold on tighter? The difference is everything. And when Molly finally steps foot in the Philippines, all she's expecting to find is a woman trapped in chaos. But what she walks into doesn't look like struggle. It looks like strategy. She walked in ready for war, expecting poverty, dysfunction, desperation, a household held together by guilt and fear. But what Molly saw instead was a well-kept home, clean lines, bright corners, a quiet yard, and 2 parents who greeted her like she was already family, not an outsider coming to judge. It wasn't supposed to look like this. She had rehearsed this visit 100 times in her head, braced herself for a dark, sad space that would confirm everything she'd been told. But there were no signs of control, no tension in the air, no subtle cues of hostility or surveillance. Instead, the mother offered food, the father smiled warmly, and the house smelled like dinner, not damage. Forrest kept stealing glances at Molly, probably waiting for her reaction, but she said nothing at first, because saying anything too soon might expose her own confusion. It wasn't until they moved to the backyard, past the blooming garden and toward the pool, that her jaw tightened slightly, her arms crossed, and her eyes started scanning for cracks, not in the tiles, but in the story she'd been sold. Her silence didn't mean she believed them. It meant she was recalibrating. This wasn't about truth anymore. It was about betrayal. Because when you trust someone's version of events enough to take action, to form judgments, to argue with your own family, and then walk into the exact opposite of what they told you, you don't feel lied to. You feel used. And that's worse. Molly didn't need every detail to match. She needed enough of the environment to signal real distress. And none of it did. The home looked peaceful. The people looked normal. And it wasn't just the aesthetics. It was the vibe, the warmth, the eye contact, the kind of small, consistent human signals that scream safety, not danger. So now her brain had 2 choices. Either everything Sheena told her was distorted, or these people were master manipulators. And because she already picked a side months ago, because she invested emotional capital in defending her son from a gold-digging scheme, it was easier to believe she was being played again, just by a different team. That's when she made the choice, not to retreat, not to give benefit of the doubt, but to confront every single contradiction with a smile on her face and fire in her chest, right there at dinner. The table was set like it mattered, like someone wanted this to go perfectly, and maybe Sheena thought that if the food was good enough, if the mood was light enough, she could stretch the evening past the confrontation, past the questions, past the mess she already knew was boiling just beneath. The surface. Traditional dishes filled the table, color and spice and heat layered across banana leaves in the kind of meal that says, "We welcome you. We honor you. We want peace." But Molly didn't come for peace. She watched Sheena's dad pass her a plate like a man unaware of what was coming, and she smiled, nodded, and took the food like she wasn't about to burn the room down. Forrest tried to lighten the mood, made a few awkward jokes, but no one was laughing too hard. There was too much unsaid. Sheena kept her eyes down, voice soft, like she knew timing was everything, and if she could just stretch the good moment long enough, maybe Molly would soften. But Molly wasn't eating for taste. She was listening, watching, cataloging every glance, every pause, every moment that didn't match what she had believed. When Sheena's dad laughed kindly and said they had always supported Sheena's dream of living in America, Molly tilted her head like she'd been handed a puzzle piece that didn't fit. This wasn't resistance. This wasn't pressure. This was encouragement. And it grated. Because the more kindness she saw, the more deeply she felt deceived. And deception does something ugly to people who thought they were doing the right thing. Respectful behavior doesn't erase struggle. Maybe Sheena still struggled. Maybe the money still mattered. But you cannot use the language of abuse and control and then expect people to sit quietly when your accusers open their home to strangers with smiles and open hands. Forrest watched his mom's expression shift in real time, her eyes getting sharper, her posture stiffening, her silence stretching too long between comments, and even though no one said it, the whole table could feel the shift coming, the moment where good manners would be set aside in favor of. Something colder, sharper, and irreversible. And then, right when the room had gone still enough to hear her breathe, Molly raised her eyes and asked the one question no one was ready for. "I was told you were taking all of Sheena's earnings." That was the moment. No soft landing, no build-up, no gentle tone, just a single sentence that shattered the warmth of the table like glass hitting tile. Molly didn't flinch, didn't soften, didn't pad the accusation with qualifiers. She threw it in the center of the table like it was already proven, and waited. Forrest froze. Sheena's face went pale. Her father blinked, confused. Her sister's smile dropped. For a split second, the air between them all stopped moving. Then came the reply. Not defensive, not angry, just confused. What? Her father's voice barely made it across the table, but it was enough. The damage was already done. Molly pressed again. She told us she didn't give you money, you threatened her, made her feel unsafe, mistreated her, called her names. And with every new sentence, the words became heavier, not because they were loud, but because they were cutting into a reputation that had no idea it was on trial. This wasn't gossip. This was exposure. And it wasn't about whether money changed hands, it was about who Sheena had painted her family to be. Monsters, manipulators, financial abusers, the kind of people who use blood ties to keep control. And now in front of them, with no warning, they were hearing that version of themselves out loud. The father looked stunned. The sister's eyes were wide, locked on Sheena, silent but pleading. Sheena didn't speak. She couldn't. Her breath caught in her chest and stayed there. And Molly, still calm, still polite, watched every reaction closely, judging sincerity, measuring expressions, silently calculating whether this moment was truth collapsing or performance deepening. Public shame does something primal. It strips people down, turns dignity into defense, turns silence into guilt. But these parents didn't lash out. They didn't argue. They defended their love. They said they never mistreated her, never threatened her, and that they didn't even know such claims had been made. And that, in some ways, was even worse. Because if they were cruel, at least the story had some weight. But if they were innocent, if this had all been constructed, then Sheena hadn't just lied about money, she'd lied about their humanity. And as every pair of eyes slowly turned toward her, the silence stretched again, waiting for her to speak, to explain, to survive the fallout of the story, collapsing in real time. She tried to speak, but the words came out broken, stuttering, swallowed by her own breath. Her voice cracked before it ever reached the end of the first sentence. And then it was all tears, hands trembling, eyes darting between faces that no longer looked safe. I tried to help you guys because you need all the help, but every time I want to save, it's not enough to get the visa. Her words fell into the air like water into fire. Nothing cooled the heat already rising around her. And yet for a moment, something shifted. Forrest blinked. Molly stayed still. Her father's expression softened into something almost pained. This wasn't the voice of someone running a con. It was the voice of someone drowning. Sheena had been carrying two impossible weights at the same time, funding her family's life and chasing a legal pathway to her own. Every dollar she sent home stretched the dream of the visa further away, and every time she missed a deadline, she must have felt it slip, 1 inch at a time. But even then, even now, that story didn't quite line up. Financial pressure explains exhaustion. It explains emotional walls. It does not explain building a false narrative of threats, abuse, and control. She said she was sorry. Again and again. She apologized to Forrest, to her parents, to the room itself, as if that could glue the broken version of her story back together. But once you plant a lie that touches someone's character, you can't unplant it with tears. The damage doesn't just stick, it stains. Molly's face didn't soften. She watched Sheena cry with the cold stillness of someone trying to calculate if what she's watching is guilt or strategy. Forrest, caught in the middle as always, rubbed his hands together, said nothing. But his silence didn't feel supportive. It felt cautious. That's when Sheena's father, after what felt like hours of stillness, finally spoke. She gave us money, yes, but it was never forever. It was always a loan. When she needs it, we'll give it back. And just like that, the entire foundation shifted again. Because if that money was a loan, and everyone knew it, then the story wasn't built on need or survival. It was built on something far more complicated. He said it as gently as he could, but the question still hit like a quiet slap across the face. So how long would it take, if she asked for her money back? Forrest wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't being aggressive. But the words weren't casual, and they didn't land that way either. Across the table, Sheena's father shifted, glanced toward his daughter, and then back at Forrest like he was trying to figure out why this request wasn't coming from her. Her sister stepped in, voice low and careful, explaining that they'd have to go through their finances, they'd need time, that this wasn't money sitting untouched. It had been used, lived through, spent with intention. The dinner no longer felt like a family gathering. It felt like a debt negotiation wrapped in leftover hospitality. Forrest's tone stayed polite, but his exhaustion showed in his eyes. He wasn't angry. He was tired of discovering new layers to stories he thought he already knew, tired of being the last to find out what everyone else already sensed. But here's what no one said aloud. Forrest didn't have a job, at least not one shown on screen, and he wasn't the one sending money. Sheena was. Yet somehow, in this room, in this moment, he was the one asking for repayment, the one carrying the authority, the one shifting the burden back onto a family who, just hours ago, had opened their home and shared their food. Power doesn't always sit where the money is. Sometimes it sits with the person who gets to define the story. And in this relationship, the quiet control wasn't financial. It was emotional, moral, positional. Forrest didn't owe money, but he held the right to decide whether Sheena was still trustworthy. And that control, that unspoken leverage, is a kind of power that doesn't scream, it whispers. You lied, but I still stayed. But that patience wasn't endless. Not for Molly. She watched the entire exchange without blinking, her arms folded so tight they seemed locked in place, and when the family finished their soft explanation, she looked directly at Sheena and didn't raise her voice, didn't shake her head, didn't blink. She just said it flat. I don't trust you. And with those 4 words, the atmosphere thickened again, because now it wasn't about the money or the past, it was about whether Sheena would ever be seen as honest again. She's the one who worked, earned, and sent the money, but now she's the one being treated like she stole it. That's what makes this so brutal. Because when Forrest presses her about the truth, when Molly narrows her eyes and says she can't believe a word that comes out of her mouth, what they're really doing is framing Sheena's support for her parents as a betrayal, not a sacrifice. But pause it for a second. What's Forrest bringing to this relationship that gives him the right to decide who gets forgiven and who doesn't? No job's been shown. No financial contribution made public. And yet somehow, he sits at that table with the authority of a man who's been wronged financially, when all he's been is surprised emotionally. That's not partnership. That's ownership. And it's not even about the money. It's about the message. That if Sheena gives to anyone else, even her own family, she's disloyal. That generosity toward her bloodline is interpreted as deception toward the man she loves. And Molly's voice doesn't shake when she says it. It's steady, measured, dressed in concern, but concern can be a disguise when it's not mutual. No one grilled Forrest about his lack of financial independence. No one questioned what he's building or who supports him. But Sheena gets interrogated for sending money back home, in a country where every dollar stretches farther and every remittance holds meaning. This isn't about fraud. It's about framing. Because if they can convince her she did something wrong, they get to define the terms of forgiveness. They get to hold the moral high ground without ever discussing the imbalance they benefit from. Control doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it shows up in phrases like, "We're just worried about you," or "We don't want to see you get hurt again." But underneath all of it sits one quiet, steady pressure: prove your loyalty by cutting ties, prove your honesty by sacrificing autonomy. And now the question hangs there, unspoken but sharp. If this is how they act when she shares, what happens if she stops? Her father didn't say much to the cameras, but the way he looked at Sheena when the dinner ended said enough, like he was trying to recognize someone he thought he knew. Someone who used to laugh without holding back, who used to share joy, not shame. Her sister said later, quietly, that it wasn't the money that hurt them. It was the story. The idea that they were seen as cruel, selfish, threatening. That their own daughter believed that framing them like villains was her best chance at love. They weren't angry, not in the way people get loud or vengeful. They were injured. Their trust was cracked in places words couldn't fix. And Forrest? He stood still through most of it, shoulders low, voice lower, not defensive, but not apologetic either. He told Sheena they needed to start over. That honesty had to be non-negotiable from now on, that this couldn't happen again. But even in that moment, his tone carried weight she didn't share. He wasn't rebuilding with her. He was setting terms. And Molly, arms still folded, didn't blink once. She didn't yell, didn't gloat, didn't say I told you so. But her silence was louder than any outburst. Public exposure reshapes trust. It doesn't just hurt, it rearranges power. Because now, every apology from Sheena feels like a concession, and every boundary from Forrest feels like a condition. This wasn't reconciliation. It was a reset, and not a clean one. Sometimes interventions don't pull people closer. They drive wedges deeper. The parents who smiled and served dinner now sat in a kind of limbo, unsure if their daughter saw them clearly or if she'd ever really trusted them in the first place. And Forrest, though choosing to stay, looked different now. Not softer, not more loving, just more cautious. The damage might not be visible, but it was there. Quiet. Sharp. Permanent. And when Molly finally spoke, her voice calm and cold, she said something that left every chair in that room heavier. Maybe we haven't heard all of it yet. They sat at that same table where it all began, but this time, no one was passing plates or refilling glasses. The food was cold, the tension wasn't, and the silence was full of questions no one wanted to ask out loud. What started as a story about survival turned into a mess of accusation, mistrust, and quiet humiliation. Except the humiliation didn't come from the lie itself, but from how publicly it was punished. Sheena didn't steal anything. She didn't fake a document. She didn't disappear with someone's money. She sent what she earned to people she loved and told a version of that story that made her seem smaller, more in need, easier to hold on to. And yes, that version caused real harm. But the punishment, the coldness, the interrogation, the shift from protection to control was its own kind of damage. The kind that doesn't make headlines, but leaves lasting scars anyway. When money becomes the centerpiece of trust, love starts feeling like a transaction. And when that money flows across borders, across cultures, across power dynamics, it becomes a test of loyalty, of ownership, of who's allowed to need and who's expected to give. Sheena lied. She distorted. She manipulated. Allegedly. But why did it take a house tour and a meal for anyone to question the story? Why did Forrest never ask why she never had enough saved, or whether her struggle might be more layered than she let on? And why did Molly walk into that house so ready to see criminals, and so slow to see people? Relationships built under immigration pressure don't get the luxury of simple conflict. Every decision, every omission carries weight. And when financial imbalance enters the mix, the person with less often has to perform more to feel safe. The tragedy isn't just that Sheena lied. It's that she believed the lie might make her more worthy of staying. But now, after all the confessions, all the tears, and all the consequences, the focus quietly shifts. Because the real question isn't whether Sheena will stay honest. The question is whether Forrest will ever grow into someone who can stand on his own. And if you think this was the final reckoning, wait until you see what Forrest does next, when no one else is watching.